Introduction. Sources of the text. The Christian Topography of Cosmas, surnamed Indicopleteus, or the Indian Navigator, has been preserved in two copies. One, a parchment manuscript of the 10th century belonging to the Lautréne Library in Florence, and containing the whole work except only the last leaf; the other, a very fine uncial uncial manuscript of the 8th or 9th centuries, belonging to the Vatican Library, and containing sketches drawn by Cosmas himself. That's interesting. There's one of those things that everybody's always wondering, what does the Vatican have? Well, this is one of those things. Wonder what else they have. But wanting entirely the 12th book, which is the last, there is besides it in the Imperial Library in Vienna a Cosmas manuscript, but this contains only a few leaves of the topography. The existence of the work has been for ages forgotten, and the importance and interest of its contents were first made known in the latter half of the 7th century by Emmerich Bigot. This learned French scholar, while visiting Italy, extracted from the Florentine Codex a copy of the Adulitic inscriptions, and of passages relating to Ethiopia and India. These extracts were afterwards published in Thevenot's Relation de Diverses Voyages, accompanied with a translation into French 20 years later, 1706. The work appeared in its complete form as exhibited in the Florentine Codex, collated with that of the Vatican. It was not, however, published separately, but was included in the second volume of the splendid work Nova Collectio Patrum et Scriptorum Graeciorum, edited by Father Montfaucon, a Benedictine monk, celebrated for his profound knowledge of patristic literature. The Greek text was illustrated by a learned introduction and a Latin translation of great elegance and accuracy. Notes were also added chiefly to point out where discrepancies exist in the reading of the manuscripts. The present translation has been prepared from Montfaucon's text, as reprinted in the 88th volume of the Petrologia Gracia, printed at the Minge Press, Paris, 1864. The title of the work in the Florentine Codex, the index of the work, reads thus. Montfaucon entitles it Cosme Egypti Monarchae. It's basically the title. Topography of Cosmas, an Egyptian monk, or the opinion of Christians concerning the world. As Cosmas, although all through the work keeps harping with the most provoking reiteration on his doctrine that the universe consists of only two places, namely the earth, which is below the firmament, and heaven, which is above it. The term topography designates the treaty properly enough, though on turning to peruse it for the first time, we should we should from its title expect its contents to be very different from what they are found to be. Notice of the work by Photius, Patriarch of Constantinople. Montfaucon does not seem to have been aware that a brief notice of the topography is to be found in the Bibliotheca of Photius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, who was elected to that dignity in AD 858. Pontius states, Photius, I think his name is, states that the work had for its title, whatever that says, and was an exposition extending to the eighth book. He does not give the author's name, but states that he flourished in the reign of the Roman Empire Justinius and dedicated his work to a certain Pamphilus. He condemns it as being below mediocrity in style and faulty in its syntax, and at the same time calls in question the author's veracity, saying that he makes up stories so incredible that he may fairly be regarded as a writer of fables rather than the facts. Wow, that's throwing shade in 700 AD. Be regarded as a writer of fables rather than of facts. He then gives a very concise summary of the contents of the topography and concludes with a reference to the last four books, which had from time to time been added to defend the doctrines set forth in those which had preceded. The name of the author of the topography. A doubt long ago arose as to whether Cosmas was the proper or family name of the author. Of the topography. Isaac Voss first started this doubt, and Fabricius subsequently gave currency to the opinion that Cosmas was so called because his work was devoted to a description of the cosmos, just as the abbot John of Sinai was called Clamisius, because he had published a work entitled Climax. In the absence of evidence, this must remain an open question. The topography fortunately contains passage which threw light on the personal history of its author and en- and enable us also to fix with certainty the date at which he wrote. He was most probably a native of Alexandria and may have been of Greek parentage. His education was confined to the more elementary branches of knowledge, such as would fit him for the career he pursued in the earlier part of his life, that of a merchant. But though he was not instructed, as he tells us himself, in the learning of the schools, yet so in but though he was not instructed, as he tells us himself, in the learning of schools, yet so inquisitive was his turn of mind, so sharp his intellect, that he eventually acquired such a knowledge of literature and science as raised him to the level of the culture of his time, and to his being accepted as a capable exponent and defender of the Christian faith. The commercial pursuits of Cosmas carried him into seas and countries far remote from his home. Thus he tells us that he had sailed upon three of the great gulfs which run up into the earth from the ocean, namely the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf. He sailed also upon that part of the Erythraean Sea, which beyond Cape Gar- Guardafui stretches southward towards the outlying ocean, which in those days was regarded with terror and held to be unnavigable on account of the violent currents and dense and dismal fogs in which it was thought to be enveloped. When the ship which carried Cosmas was approaching this dread region of currents and fogs, a storm gathered overhead, and flocks of albatross like birds of ill omen hovered on the wing high above the mast. Dismay seized alike the passengers and the crew, and amidst outcries of "Port the helm!" the course of the vessel was reversed, and she headed northwards. Cosmas does not say whether in the course of this voyage he reached India, which was his destination when he embarked. If he did not, he must have made a second and more successful attempt, for no one, we think, who reads his 11th book, in which he describes the island of Ceylon and the ports, commerce, and animals of India, can doubt that he writes about these places from personal knowledge of them. Wow, that's a compliment. They're saying that based on what he wrote and logged, no one can doubt that he actually did what he said when it comes to traveling to India. But everything else about the earth being flat, he's just dead wrong. On one of the most interesting and instructive parts of the topography is that in which Cosmas relates what he had heard and seen in the course of his travels in Ethiopia. By the name of Ethiopia, he designates in a general way the vast region which stretches southward from Egypt down towards the equator, and from an incidental remark which he drops when treating of the Aldelic inscription on the throne, we learn that he had traversed it almost throughout its length and its breadth, like Herodotus the of old. He was ever Arthurist after knowledge. Forever he was ever athirst after knowledge, and 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 when he was unable to visit places which lay in the vicinity of his route, he made inquiries about them from such persons as knew them and could be trusted to report things truly. The capital of Ethiopia at that time was Axum, an important center of commerce and also of religion and learning. It was one of the places which Cosmas, in pursuit of his calling, visited, and from one or two of his statements we may infer that he was well received at court and was permitted by the king, who professed the Christian faith and could speak Greek, to travel freely through his dominions. The seaport of Axum was Adul, or Adulis, the modern Zula or Thula, situated near Annesley Bay, and distant from the capital which 120 miles, or an 8 days' journey. Cosmas found himself here in the year 525 AD. So in 525 he was doing this stuff. You know what I mean? That's uh, that's very interesting. at which time Lesbos, the king of Axum, was preparing an expedition against the Homerites in Arabia. Here, at the request of the governor, Cosmas, along with his friend Menas, a monk of the monastery at Rhythu, copied the famous Greek inscription on the marble tablet and the Bassanite throne, which lay together outside the town on the road which led to Axum, among other parts of Ethiopia, which our traveler visited. We may include the aromatic country, that great projection on the east of the African continent, which terminates in Cape Gardefari. His description of the district which supplied the Egyptians of old with their spices embalming the dead, for embalming the dead, and of its products and its foreign trade, shows that it must have come from the pen of an eyewitness. He may he may also have proceeded to the northwest and visited the kingdom of Meroe, now Cathrum, for in that direction lay the seats of several tribes mentioned in the inscription on the throne. Montfaucon, in his preface, credits him with the discovery, in the Abyssinian province called Agau, of the true source of the Nile. It was not, however, the source of the main stream, which he discovered, but that of the Blue Nile, which a millennium afterwards was rediscovered by the Portuguese and more recently by the Scottish traveler Bruce. There was still another interesting locality which the traveler tells us he visited, and this lay on the other side of the Red Sea, the desert, namely, of Sinai, where he found strewn among the sands fragments of rock covered with inscriptions, which he took to have been carved by the Israelites when they were wandering in the wilderness. Oh, yeah, I forgot about that part. That was really kind of cool. As the Israelites were wandering through the wilderness, they were carving on stones different things, and this guy happened to be seeing all of those things as he was traveling. So it was almost like he was walking through their path, which is, I mean, that's really cool. I've never been able to really travel or anything like that, but people who have been able to go and see the things in which spiritually our ancestors have gone through, they had their walk at their time and what was called of them to do, and we have our walk at this time of what we are called to do. It's just, I think that kind of stuff is beautiful. All right. Um, Cosmas, when all his travels were over, returned to Alexandria, perhaps after paying a visit to Jerusalem, and abandoning the secular life, retired to the seclusion of the cloister, where he devoted his leisure to the composition of works on descriptive geography, cosmography, and scriptural exegesis. Exeges. Of these, the Christian topography alone is extant. The loss of the geographical treaty, as Montfaucon well says, is to be deplored with tears. It has been conjectured that the geographical passages in the topography, as, for instance, the description of Ceylon in the 11th book, are extracts from that treaty. The Christian sect to which Cosmas belonged in the days of Cosmas, ecclesiastical controversies were rife, and professing Christians were divided. They have always been, wow, what a surprise, into numerous sects. That to which Cosmas most probably belonged was to the Nestorian. To this point, Photius makes no reference, and it has been equally overlooked by Montfaucon. The first who called in question the orthodoxy of our monk was de la Croze, who, in his Historia de Christiana de Indies, adduced the following arguments to prove his Nestorian prolivities, that Cosmas calls Patricius, who was the Archbishop of Persia when that country had been infected with Nestorianism, a divine man and illustrious teacher. Okay. That Cosmas, in his list of heretical sects, names the Manichaeans, the Marcionists, the Eutychians, the Arians, and the Apollinarians. Interesting. But not the Nestorians. That in his exposition of Scripture and in his system of the world, he always follows Theodosius of Montpestia and Diodorus of Tarsus, who were the principal teachers of the Nestorians. The concerning Christ, 4 degrees, fourth point. That concerning Christ and the incarnation of the Word, he uses the same modes of expression as the Nestorians. We may add as a fifth argument the glowing terms in which Cosmas speaks of the wide diffusion of Christianity among the heathen nations of the East, which was namely the work of missionaries from Persia, where Nestorianism reigned supreme. Only one passage occurs to throw some doubt on the certainty of this conclusion, that in which Cosmas addresses Mary as the Mother of God, an expression abhorrent to the Nestorians. Had Cosmas in his monastery relapsed into what was there considered orthodoxy. The date at which the topography was written. We have already mentioned that the topography has data from which the time when Cosmas wrote can be certainly determined in the second book, page 55, where he mentions his visit to Adule. He observes that it was made when Elesbos, the Aksumite king, was preparing an expedition against the Homerites in Arabia, and that this was at the beginning of the reign of the Roman Emperor Justinus, since which time some 5 and 20 years more or less has elapsed now, as it is known that the expedition was made in AD 522 and that Justinius was at the date of the 5th year of his reign. Cosmas must have been writing about the year 547. It is true that an indication which apparently conflicts with this appears in the 10th book, page 351, where he speaks of Theodosius, the heretical bishop of Alexandria, as residing at the time of Constantinople, and then on page 535 refers to the death of his predecessor in office, Timothy the Younger, as an event of recent occurrence. Now it is known that that this Timothy died in 535 and was succeeded by Theodosius, who, after a brief residence in his diocese, went to Constantinople, whence he was banished in 536. The 10th book must therefore have been written in the year preceding. How then is this earlier date to be reconciled with the later? Montfaucon answers this question satisfactorily. Cosmas, he points out, in order to meet objections urged against his opinions, was in the habit of making additions from time to time to the number of its books. The earlier date thus probably indicates the time when he began to make such additions, and the later when he was making the last, or one of the last, recessions for his work. Opinions of the learned regarding the topography. The condemnatory verdict of Photius upon the work of Cosmas has not been endorsed by modern opinion. The style of the topography has no doubt the shortcomings which the patriarch pointed out, but Cosmas, it is proper to remember, expressly disclaims all presentations to the learning of the schools. He pleads that from his early years he had been so engrossed in business and had been besides so much abroad that he had found no spare time for studying rules of grammar and the art of composition. He could therefore, that sounds like me, but I didn't do such a great work in all these travels. He doesn't seem like such a dumb guy. He seems like the type of person that the Most High would use to shed truth because he seems to always use the, you know, the underdog, you know. And in my experience, both personally and vicariously through other people's testimonies, uh, some of the people that turn to the Most High have been to the bottom, you know. And when you've been to the bottom, drug addiction, depression, you know, suicidal, you know, you might be a prostitute or selling your body or, you know, like when you've been to that frequency and when you've been around people who are that broken, you know, when you come into learning about what the Most High has promised for you, it's like, well, I mean, it seems like if this is real, I might as well chase this than death because what if I die and then this is actually real? Then it makes no sense for me to live like this. I might as well turn my life around and give it to something because I don't feel like anything, you know? And he says, those who humble themselves will be exalted, and those who exalt themselves will be humbled. Well, if you've ever seen a righteous person start to get too ahead of themselves, the Most High humbles them and then they turn around too. But somebody who's already been put super, super low, they can only go up from there, you know? So I find it really interesting that they're talking so much about how dumb this guy is, and yet they still feel the need to preserve his works and even keep a specific copy in like the most well preserved copy in the Vatican itself. So, I don't know. He pleads that from his early years he had been so engrossed in business and had been besides so much abroad that he found no spare time for studying rules of grammar and the art of composition. He could, therefore, only write in a homely style, without attempting any flights of rhetoric. Rhetoric, moreover, would, he thought, be out of place in his books, since he wrote for Christians who had more need of correct notations than of fine phrases. The style, and you can apply that to people who produce content too, especially these people who are always like spending so much time trying to make fun of people who believe in alternative cosmology and just really when you listen to people, you can tell when they convolute their speech so much with things that they know that the average listener can't comprehend, that since they say it with so much confidence, confidence is infectious. Confidence is contagious, you know, and you can work that into your speech. The whole point of communication is to convey your actual feelings, thoughts, and, ideas with someone else so that they can actually comprehend it and, a sense of understanding or feeling, you know. Mm, there's very little physical to do with communication outside of, the fact that you have to use your mouth and your body and stuff like that. I don't know. Who am I, man? I don't know. Who knows? But you get these influencers that they won't talk about. They can say a whole lot of stuff and not say anything. Like me. Say a whole lot of things and not say anything at all. The style has notwithstanding some redeeming points. Cosmas, in spite of his loose grammar, seldom fails to make his meaning clear, or to put forward his arrangements with sufficient point and force. Some passages, besides, which give us an insight into the depth and fervor of his faith, rise to be an eloquence, rise to an eloquence which that belief suggests the belief that had he cultivated the art, he might have shown in pulpit oratory. It is, however, in relating to his traveling experiences that Cosmas has found at his best, the language he uses is simple, and his descriptions are not only remarkably vivid, but are above all things truthful. In his respect, modern opinion is entirely to variance with that of Photius. The greater knowledge now possessed of the remote regions which Cosmos visited goes all to show that the thought of tickling the fancy of his readers with tales of wonder had never entered his mind, but that on the contrary he was a man who had a supreme regard for truth, and who was at once an acute observer and shrewd in judging the value of the information which he received from others. As soon as the topography in its complete edition by Bonfassion made its appearance, it excited great interest in the circles of learning, and at once took rank as a work which contained more accurate and more valuable information on geographical subjects than any other document that had come down from the early medieval age. Introduction. At the same time, I don't know why I read that. That's always at the top. At the same time, the extreme singularity of the views which it pro which which it propounded on cosmology and on interpretation of scripture texts filled its readers with combined feelings of amazement and amusement. See, that's another thing is I don't understand where this whole amazement and amusement comes from. I mean, yeah, it is amazing that you look up and you see that the figure of the stars never change. You know, every single one of them has a different identity and characteristic, shine, sparkle, twinkle. They all have a different method of how they operate. They all have a different signature, a light signature, whether that be the vibration, the way it, everything about them. They never move from their places except for the ones that the scripture actually says. And the scriptures say that they're being moved by angels through by chariots of wind in that realm of the firmament. I think that that is amazing. And, reading that in the scripture is going to fill you with feelings of amazement and amusement. Why? Because it was made for that specific reason. Just like it says in Psalms 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Well, you look at the firmament alone, and the firmament is the structure itself, but then the realms that exist within the different levels and parts of the firmament is what's most amazing about all of it, because it's the firmament is like the actual enclosure, the terrarium, the multi-stage level thing that he made to put us all inside of. All of us, all the angels, all the stars, all the animals, all the seas, all the mountains, everything. The underworlds, everything. Everything is within this system, and then outside of that is nothingness. Outside of that is only known to the Most High, which to me, I can't comprehend things like that. And when you really, really, really think about it, where do they get this idea of a vast majority of a vacuum of space of nothingness? They get it from the scripture. Everything that they get from the Most High. They just turn it into their own thing. Everything they do, everything they think, everything that has ever come from them, even though nothing ever changes. You never see any other sides of any planets, any moons, nothing. You always see the exact same thing all the time. They tell you the Earth is every 30 days, it's wobbling to the left and it's wobbling to the right, and then it'll wobble down to the left a little bit more and it'll cause the seasons to go and change. But during all that wobbling, the stars never change. They try to reconcile the movements of the sun and the moon by saying that we're wobbling and the earth is moving and we're spinning at the same time. But the stars never change. So if I'm wobbling, why aren't the stars changing? You can tell me I'm wobbling and maybe I'll believe you for a few years. But when you stop and you look at what's going on and you look at everything, it's not. It's not. It's too consistent. There is a beauty in consistency. There is a beauty in uniform, unchanging nature. You can always depend on the honeybee to make the honey. You can always depend on the cow to develop the milk. You always know the seeds that you plant. Some are going to go, some are going to come, some are going to produce lots, and some are going to produce little. Some might not produce at all, and some of them may not even make it into the ground to get watered, right? But that's consistent with your efforts on how you manage and what the Most High decides to bless you with. But there's consistency in all of it. All of it. And not only is there consistency, it doesn't change. It has very specific patterns, and then those patterns are repeated on a yearly basis, exactly the way he says they are from the beginning. And the only thing they do is they take what he tells you and then they flip it into what they want. It is, I don't understand why they would say something like that, as if it's a bad thing to be inspired or to be filled with feelings of amazement and amusement. I'm not sure. Anyways, bibliographical notes. The topography was republished at Venice in 1776 in Galandi's Bibliotheca Veterum Patrum, and its most valuable sections were printed along with a French translation at Paris in 1855. In Charton's Voyageurs Anciens et Modernes, its its con its contents were made use of by Robertson in his disquisition on ancient India, and by Gibbon in his history of the decline of the fall of the Roman Empire. The latter referring to the absurd theory of the world held by Cosmas, remarks that the nonsense of the monk was nevertheless mingled with the practical knowledge of the traveler. Among the eminent geographers who have turned the topography to account may be mentioned Merritt, Goslam, Humboldt, Dodwell, Playfair, Bedwell. I'm not going to read all that. I don't know what that's for. I don't. While among ecclesiastical writers may be noted Alatius Brandani, Cave, and Millinare. The Audiolic inscriptions again have exercised the pens of such scholars. If you want to read all this stuff, you can. I don't like reading names because I trip over every single one of them. The system of the world according to Cosmas. The Christian topography is a production of which it may be truly said it is essentially controversial, its professed design being to refute from Scripture the common sense, the impious pagan cosmography, according to which the earth is a sphere, and the center around which the heaven, which is also a sphere, revolves with all its luminaries. Okay, so let me make sure everyone understands what was happening back then. It wasn't always that we were a sphere and then it was just everything and crazy distances everywhere around us. You know, when you look at a lot of the old, you know, pieces of work that they create around this time, you'll always notice that they'll have like a globe, but then around the globe there will be all these different rings that are spinning in a whole bunch of different directions, and that's because they believe that the different firmaments are spherical. The pagans believed that. Okay, so come on, guys. It's not like this was a progressive walk into, oh, now we have black holes and now we have asteroids this big that are flying. It was a progressive move into this. It started off as they just want the earth to be a sphere and they want the heavens and firmaments to be spheres that are all moving in different ways. And then it turned into this whole planets and spaces and all this other stuff about the sun being 93 million miles away and everything. All right. Uh, the arguments of which Cosmas seeks to demolish this theory. Oh, wait. Also, it, pagan cosmography, according to which the earth is a sphere, and the center around which the heaven, which is also a sphere, revolves with all its luminaries. The arguments with which Cosmas seeks to demolish this theory and to illustrate his own are absurd in the extreme. It's more absurd to believe that you're you're literally not moving. You can't feel it, you can't see it. Everything seems to always stay the same, exactly as it's been described to you in this instruction book that was given by the creator of the place. It's more absurd to believe that than to believe that you're on a giant water ball floating around with an unknowable amount of other giant water balls with spacious, gaseous stars that never run out of fuel, that are always shining these colors that we've never seen here on Earth. We cannot replicate any of these light patterns. We can't replicate any of them. And it's just, you know, it's more, it doesn't matter. And were it not for these geographical, historical, and other kinds of notices, which are here and there incidentally introduced into its pages, his work would chiefly serve for amusement. According to his view, the figure of the universe can be best learned from a study of the scripture and furniture of the tabernacle, which Moses prepared in the wilderness. This wonderful conception did not originate with himself. Some of the Christian fathers who preceded him had some of the Christian fathers who preceded him had entertained it in a vague and general way, believing it might be warranted by the expression in Hebrews 9:23 and 24, where the tabernacle and its contents are said to be patterns and types or figures of the true. Interesting. It was left to Cosmos to develop the conception and work it out into all its details. So he explains again and again that the division of the tabernacle into two places by means of the veil typified the division of the universe into two worlds, an upper and a lower, by means of the firmament, and the table of showbread again with its weaved border represented the earth surrounded by the ocean, while its other parts and other things upon it symbolized each some objects or other in the natural world. Now, as the table was twice as long as it was broad, and was placed lengthwise from east to west, and breadthwise from north to south. From this we learn that the earth is a rectangular plane which extends in length from east to west and in breadth from north to south, and is twice as long as it is broad. The ocean, he further gives to us to know, is unnavigable, and while encompassing this earth of ours, it itself encompassed by another earth which had been the seat of paradise and the abode of man until the ark floating on the billows of the flood wafted Noah and his family over into this earth. Very interesting stuff, guys. The heavens come downward to us in four walls. which at their lower sides are welded into four sides of the earth beyond ocean, each to each. The upper side of the northern wall at the summit of heaven curves round and over till it unites with the upper side of the southern wall and thus forms in the shape of an oblong vault. The canopy of heaven, which Cosmas likened to the vaulted roof of a bathroom. This vast rectangular hall is divided at the middle into two stories by the firmament, which thus serves as a ceiling for the lower story and a floor for the upper. The lower story is the world where men and angels have their abode until the resurrection, and the story above is heaven, the place of the future state. As to the position of the earth in the scheme of things, Scripture left Cosmos in no doubt. The psalmist. Okay, so it's very, very interesting that in Scripture and in we try to look at these luminaries and everything, and we see like so much, but it's so interesting that the way this guy sees a lot of this stuff is that one, how many people do we have saying that the earth is a perfect circle, and yet when you look at the sun, you see that it has long strokes and then short turns, long strokes and then short turns that are constantly going back and forth, back and forth. It is going in like a circle, but it's like a oval. Otherwise, it wouldn't raise so perfectly in the east and set so perfectly in the west. It would be more of like a raise in the east, set more in the northwest. You know what I mean? I don't know if that makes sense, but it's kind of almost moving in like an oval pattern. Anyways, what do I know? As to the position of the earth in the scheme of things, excuse me, Scripture left Cosmos in no doubt. The psalmist had declared that the Creator had founded the earth upon its own. Oh, and what I was also going to say is how he recognizes that the angels actually have some sort of operating level within the heavens, which is in like the sky, the air realms. Remember, these are spirits, so there's no gravity, okay? There's no such thing as gravity. You are on the earth because you were made in the earth. Just like when you look up at the clouds, clouds exist at a certain altitude where the air becomes a different viscosity. Airplanes are engineered to operate, uh, a little more forcefully within this level, but as they go higher and the viscosity of air changes, the temperature of air changes, they're able to adjust their air fuel ratios for their turbines and it become ridiculously efficient at being able to fly because you're using the air around you. You're using, you know, anyways, the angels hang out in the sky, everybody. Congratulations, spoiler alert. Um, Job, the psalmist had declared that the Creator had founded the earth upon its own stability. Job, that he had hanged it upon nothing, and Isaiah, that while heaven was his throne, the earth was his footstool. Clearly, therefore, the place of the earth was at the bottom of the universe, a position to which it must have naturally sunk, as he shows in a very curious passage at the very at the very instant of its creation. What then can be more absurd than a pagan doctrine that the earth is in the middle of the universe, where it in the middle there must be something below it as well as above it, but there is nothing below it, since we learn from Genesis that God made heaven and earth and nothing else beyond these. Here, then, the pagans are at war with divine scripture, but not content with this. They are at war also with common sense itself, and the very laws of nature, declaring as they do the earth is a central sphere, and that there are antipodes who must be standing a head downward, on whom the rain must fall up. You hear that? It is ridiculous to think that there are people on the opposite side of a ball that have rain falling up towards them because of their beloved gravity. Wow. But hold on, everybody. There's no variation or difference in the characteristics of cloud formation, air density, you know, any of that stuff. Nothing. Everything works exactly the same. It's just, you just gotta get over it. And there's no seismic activity within the 24 hours that the sun suddenly changes its position because of the Earth's tilt either. That happens every 30 days, right? Wow. Referring to the figure of the world as thus conceived by Cosmas, Sir Henry Yule, with grim humor, remarked that one of the huge re receptacles receptacles in which female travelers of our day carry their dresses forms a perfect model of the cosmos of Cosmos. The theory by which Cosmos accounts for the vicissitudes of today and night is no less preposterous than his idea of the figure of the world. The pagan theory that the earth is spherical and placed in the center of the universe, with the heavenly bodies revolving around it, according with the heavenly bodies revolving around it, accounted satisfactorily for the disappearance of the sun during the night, but where could Cosmas, in whose philosophy there was neither a spherical earth nor any underworld, find a place for the great orb of light when no longer visible? The problem did not baffle his ingenuity, calling it to his aid the words of Solomon, which declared that the sun on rising turned first toward the south and then towards the north, where he went down, and thence hasted to the place in which he arose. He made them the bias of the following extraordinary theory. The earth, he tells us, gradually rising up from the south, extends westward until it culminates at the last in the huge conical mountain suited somewhere in the far away frozen north. Okay, so that's another thing, guys, is they tell us these things about north, south, east, and west, but north is quite possibly much further than we've been made to believe. And also, much more north, I don't know. When you start to see some of these people who are traveling to Antarctica and they're in the plane and they're taking film when they're not really supposed to, sometimes those planes go a little bit higher, right? And you start to see how many mountainous ranges are out there in the areas of which they call Antarctica, whichever region of the so-called Antarctica you're going to. It's like massive, massive amounts of mountains. And not only is it a mess load of mountains, the valleys between a lot of these mountains have ice that is consistently moving forward and being pushed into a large body of water where it seems to just cut off and start melting because of the difference in temperature. It's amazing, guys. It's amazing. These things are things that we should be considering and thinking about when reading the scripture and reading the descriptions in which the Most High gives us. Regardless of how you feel about this guy's work or his travels, he did the traveling at a time when the traveling was allowed to be done, right? So we should consider a little bit of what he has to say. The earth, he tells us, gradually rising up from the south, extends westward until it culminates at the last in a huge conical mountain situated somewhere in the faraway frozen north. Behind this immense cone, the sun at the close of day disappears from view and leaves the world which we inhabit in darkness until, having circled around the cone, he reappears in the east to give birth to a new day according, moreover, as he is high or low during his nocturnal revolution. The nights vary in their length, while owing to a slight obliquity in his motion, eclipses are produced on and that's another thing is you'll notice that these intersections, these times when they might have um their conjunctions, the solar and lunar conjunctions where they're passing each other, but just like you read in the book of Enoch, they're not always passing on the same track. They're not always using the same following the same patterns, you know? It's very, very interesting so that when they intersect, they're only intersecting at certain times. It's just it's super interesting and it's predictable. Why is it predictable? Why is it so predictable? And they'll tell you, well, we can calculate the way that the gravity is going to move us, and it's only going to move us 6 inches this way for 30 days, and then it's going to move us back another 6 inches. And it's like, guys, if we're moving so much, why can't we record this movement? The movement takes place within 12 hours. The entire Earth just up and decides that it's going to move like whatever in 24 and 12 hours from sunset to sunrise. Suddenly we're in a different position and no one notices. There's no movement whatsoever. Nothing recorded, no time lapses. The stars don't actually move, only the sun and the moon do. And it's all because of this weird rotation that we're doing. Guys, come on. Really, think about it. Think about it. Now, do I know if there's a giant mountain in the north of a rectangle flat earth that the sun goes behind as an oblate sphere position or an oblate circle, which is it's really interesting that they say it's oblate spheroid because that's just another shape that's being shared from whatever. On the question of the magnitude of the great luminary, excuse me, Cosmas differed widely from the pagan philosophers and wrote his sixth book mainly to prove that instead of its being as they thought many times larger than the earth, it was no more than the size of only two of the earth's climates or zones, those between the latitudes of Alexandria and Rhodes and Constantinople. an extent of about 635 geographical miles. But the words of Solomon from by no means the only scriptural warrant for taking this view of the order of nature, for the candlestick placed on the south of the table of the showbread typified the sun shining upon the earth from the south towards the north, while the weaved border which ran around the table typified the ocean surrounded by the outer earth, both of which were illuminated by the sun while circling round the gigantic mountain. Interesting things here, people. The pagan theory, which Cosmas especially detested and made most frequently the subject of his scornful and violent invective, was that which maintained that the heavens were spherical and in constant revolution. The heaps He heaps text upon text to confute the advocates of his most pestilent doctrine, which, if admitted, would be he contended, abolish the future state and make the resurrection of Christ of no account. But while Cosmas regarded as impious the doctrine that the heavens revolve, he admitted the revolution of the celestial luminaries, which he held were propelled in their courses by the angels who do not live in heaven, but are restricted to the aerial spaces below the firmament until the resurrection. All these and other views, no less absurd, though interesting, Cosmos states and restates with the most wearisome per, pertin, pertinacity, pertinacity, and holding them to the most vital varieties, sanctioned alike by common sense and the paramount authority of divine scripture, denounces again and again those reprobate Christians who, instead of accepting them, prefer, through their previous folly or downright wickedness, to adopt the miserable pagan belief that the earth and heaven are spherical, and that the antipodes, which are people walking upside down, on whom the rain must fall up. Criticisms of his system. Since the topography had for its main design the exposition of these views, it has been compared to Yule to a mere bank of mud, but remarkable on account of certain geographical fossils which are found embedded in it. The comparison, however, we venture to think, does less than justice to the work, for besides the geographical, there are many other fossils to be found in the mud, of different kinds, of generally of more or less interesting interest and value. A list of these, but not pretending to be complete, has been given by Montfaucon in his introduction. Among others, may be specified the indication of Clisma as the place of the passage of the Red Sea, the wares brought by merchants to the Israelites when they sojourned in the wilderness, and the wilderness, the seat of the terrestrial paradise, the worship of Mithras by the Persians, the rite of baptism, the date of nativity, the question of the canonicity of the Catholic epistles, the exposition of the prayer of Hezekiah, which was interesting, the inscriptions on the rocks found in the desert of Sinai, and the state of Christianity in Soctra, Sklion, and India, the extent to which Christianity had spread over the heathen world, the interpretation of the prophecies of Daniel, extracts from the pagan writers and fathers of the church, preserved only by Cosmas, and his views of the destiny of children who die in the womb or in infancy. The portion, moreover, for the topography, which is the mud bank of the comparison, is not without some value. It is a specimen of a once prevalent and not yet quite extinct mode of scriptural exegesis. It reveals that were some of the main currents of thought which permeated the Christian world at the beginning of the Middle Ages. It discloses to what a lamentable degree as monotheistic Christianity rose to the ascendant, triumphant alike over the Persian dualism of the Manichaeans and the Greek pantheism of the Neoplatonists. The light of Hellenic learning and science had faded from Christendom before as yet Islam, which was destined to receive and preserve the light, had appeared in the world. And while it exhibits the attitude in which theology and science in those days stood to each other, it illustrates the signal danger, the signal danger of regarding Scripture as a storehouse of divine communications, which may be turned to account in defending or in oppu- oppugning scientific speculations. To quote Yule once more, the work is a memorable example of that mischievous process of loading Christian truth with a dead weight of false science. Other works besides the topography written by Cosmas, besides the Christian topography, Cosmas wrote several other works, of which the most important was one addressed to Constantinus, in which he described the whole earth. Cosmas mentions in book 1. A second was entitled A Delineation or Image of the Universe and of the Stellar Motion, made in imitation of the artificial sphere of the pagans, and a treaty thereon addressed to the most pious deacon Homogelos. A third book was a commentary on the Song of Songs, and the fourth an exposition of the Psalms. General nature of contents of each book of the topography. To the topography, when first published, Cosmas prefixed two prologues, in which the first of which he exhorts his readers to bestow upon his works a diligent and careful perusal, and in the second, which contained the dedication to Pamphilus and apologies for his own shortcomings as a writer, he points out the nature of the contents of each of the 5 books of which the work then consisted. In the first book, he attacks, and to his own satisfaction demolishes, the pernicious anti-Christian doctrines of the pagan philosophy that of the pagan philosophers themselves by the citation of measurements of the earth made from east to west and from north to south. He seeks to prove that the length of the earth is twice its breadth. In the third book, he insists on the authority and harmony of Scripture adducing many texts which, as in the preceding book, he twists with audacious ingenuity to lend support to his own impossible theory. In the two following books, he again demolishes the doctrine of the spheres, while he restates and fortifies his own theory with a long array of additional texts. The publication of these books, which gave definite and uncompromising expression to views of which the germs had long been vaguely floating about in the air of Christendom, produced, as might have been expected from their novelty when seen wrought together into a self-consistent system, of startling effect. Objections were urged, directed especially against his views regarding the figure of the world. How he has how, he was asked, could the sun, which was many times larger than the earth, be hidden behind the mountain in the north, however great is its altitude? The sixth book was written to show that the sun, so far from being many times larger than the earth, was a point of fact only the size of the two earth's climates. The seventh book, addressed to Athanaeus, sought to refute a work written by a professing Christian who held that heaven was an ever-revolving sphere, but nevertheless dissoluble. Cosmas cites and expounds numerous texts to show that the heavens cannot be dissolved, and that neither men nor angels can enter into them until after the resurrection. The eighth book is addressed by Cosmas to another of his friends called Peter, who had asked him to expound the prayer of Hezekiah, and the exposition is given by, and Cosmas then proceeds to show how the minds of the Babylonians had been impressed by the miraculous sign of the retrogression of the shadow upon the sundial, and how Cyrus had been led to favor the Jews and dismiss them from their Babylonian captivity by his reading the prophecies of Isaiah, which referred to himself even by name. The ninth book, treating of the heavenly bodies, ascribed their motions to the angels, who groan under this hard and incessant toil which they perform for the benefit of man and not for their own. They would have sunk, therefore, into despair had they not seen that. Had they not seen that, even after the fall, God was merciful and kind to man, on whose des- destinies their own depended. They were further encouraged when they afterwards saw that the Apostle Paul was caught up in the third heaven, and was there entertained with a glimpse of its glories. In the 10th book, Cosmas cites a number of the fathers to show that the doctrines were in closest harmony with the teachings of the Church. In the 11th, which is entirely geographical, he describes some animals and plants which he had seen or heard of in the course of his travels, and gives an account also of the island of Ceylon and of its extensive commerce with India, Persia, China, and the countries of the West. The 12th. Introduction. In the last book shows that several of the old pagan writers bore testimony to the antiquity of the Old Testament scriptures. The maps and sketches which illustrate the views of Cosmas there is, says Mr. Raymond Beasley in the admirable work we have already referred to, another interest about the topography. It contains in all probability the oldest Christian maps that have survived. There is little reason to doubt that the numerous sketches which are to be found in the Florentine manuscript of the 10th century were really drawn by Cosmas himself, or under his direction, in the 6th, and are thus at least 2 centuries earlier than the map of Albi or this original sketch of the Spanish monk Beatus, page 281. The plates found in the appendix have been reproduced by photography for those which accompany Mountfaucon's edition of the topography. The place of Cosmas in history with regard to the place of which Cosmas holds in history, we cannot do better than cite the estimate expressed by the same writer, whose wide and accurate knowledge of medieval literature enables him to speak ex cathedra, cathedra on the subject. Cosmas, he says, is of interest to us as the last of the old Christian geographers, and in a sense to the first of the medieval. He closes one age of civilization which had slowly declined from the self-sustained completeness of the classical world, and he prepares us to enter another that in comparison is literally dark. From the rise of Islam, the geographical knowledge of Christendom is on a par with its with its practical contraction and apparent decline. Even more than actual exploration, theoretical knowledge seemed on its deathbed for the next 500 years. In a subsequent passage dealing with the same topic, he says, the place of Cosmos in history has been sometimes misconceived. His work is not, as it has been called in the earlier years of this century, the chief authority of the Middle Ages in geography, for on the whole its influence is only slightly and occasionally traceable. Its author stated his position as an article of Christian faith, but even in those times there was anything but a general agreement with his positive conclusions. The subtleties of Cosmos were left to the Greeks for the most part. The Western geographers who pursued the line of thought were usually content to stop short at the merely navigate negative dogmas of the Latin fathers, and no great support was given to the constructive tabernacle system of the Indian merchant. Yet after the Christian topography must always be remarkable. It is one of the earliest important essays in scientific or strictly theoretic geography within the Christian era, written by Christian thinkers. Page. Mr. Beasley concludes his long notice of the great Christian cosmographer in these terms. He felt himself to be the apostle of the full supernatural theory in science. He knew he knew that his work was unique, and such it has always been recognized by some with rapture, by others with consternation, by most with derision. At least it is a monument of infinite, because quite unconscious humor, for neither before him was any like unto him, neither shall be after.